we are in week 2 of this series called What Made Jesus Mad? And think about this question. I think that you can learn more about somebody by what makes them mad than learning, what makes them happy, right? We learn more about them as we learn what makes them mad, right? I think about my family growing up. My dad, don't remember a ton about the things he really, really loved, the things he really liked, but I remember once I called him a name, and I never called him that name again. I know to this day he did not like when I said that word about him. In my family with my mom growing up, we had, when we would butt heads the most, it was when I would challenge her, when I would try to correct her and tell her she was wrong about something. She did not like that at all. So I was kind of born with a silver foot in my mouth. Lots of issues with the way that I make people feel with how I use my words, but I learned who they were by what made them mad. In my marriage today, my wife and I, we just celebrated on Friday our 11th wedding anniversary, and wow, 11, it's an awesome thing. It's really, really incredible. But I'll tell you this, in our 11 years and then 4 years before that dating, I know more about her by what makes her mad than what makes her happy, because nothing sets her off more than when I'm ready to go somewhere and I'm like, got my keys, jingling my keys, and I'll ask her like, hey, what are you even doing? What have you even been doing? And then she just like lists off like the 30 things she's done in the last 5 minutes to take care of Jack and everything around the house. And she just gives me that look. And guys, you know that look? I know a lot about my wife by what makes her mad. And I think it's a fascinating thing for us to think about. As a church, we're trying to follow the real Jesus. We're trying to understand what it's like to follow Jesus. And so I'm fascinated by this question: what made Jesus mad? What set him off? I mean, he was the human embodiment of grace and kindness and mercy and compassion, but he was not soft. And as we've discovered in this series, and as we'll move forward and discover, there were things that angered him. And last week we looked at that passage where we said he had the temple tantrum, which was what was going on inside of the temple. And I want to look at those things that made him mad in a way to understand more about him and to make sure that I'm not in the way of his what he would be mad about, but I am in the way of following him into the life that he has called me into. And so last week we said, as we were kicking off this series, this is overall what made Jesus mad in lots of different ways, was this sentence right here. Jesus got mad when his followers got in the way of his love. When religious people, when church people would do something unintentionally or intentionally to build a barrier and to get in the way of his love in somebody else. This is what set Jesus off. This is what made him mad, because if Jesus came to do anything, he came to give every single person full access to God, full VIP access to God, life with God, this abundant life that starts now and it goes through all of eternity. He wanted to bring that to everyone. And his followers, you and me, if we're not careful, we can be in the way of his love, and we can get in the way of his love reaching somebody else. And this is what makes Jesus mad. And so this morning, as we continue on in the series, we're going to talk about how sometimes religious rules and laws made Jesus mad, because religious rules and laws and putting heavy burdens on people and wagging the finger at people, man, it made Jesus mad. So we're going to talk about rules and laws. I went to a conservative Christian college. Indiana Wesleyan University had some of my greatest years there. Some of my lifelong friends I met on 3 North of Hodson, which is the dorm that I lived in. I had an incredible time. But one of the funny things about going to a conservative Christian school is that there's lots of rules and laws that they put on you when you get there. A lot of mandates, right? And just to run you through some of the things that I had to do while I was in college, it's kind of a silly thing. But there was a curfew. Yeah, I was like 21 years old, and I had to like check into my dorm, right? When we were dating, my wife and I, or at the time we were just dating, there were actually open dorm hours. So there were just a couple hours, 3 days a week, that Megan could even come into my dorm. And the door had to be open, 4 feet on the floor, no blankets. I mean, they got really granular with this thing, right? There were dating hours where it was appropriate for her to hang out with me in my room. There was no alcohol. Even after you turned 21, you weren't supposed to not have it on campus, you weren't supposed to have it at all. You like signed a piece of paper saying that you would never drink alcohol. And maybe the most ridiculous thing, the rules that we had at school, it's kind of funny now, was that you weren't allowed to watch R-rated movies at all. Your RA could like skim through your DVDs back when we had DVDs and see if you had any R-rated movies. And there were just a list of like 4 or 5 R-rated movies we were allowed to watch while we were at Indiana Wesleyan. There was a small approved list, and one of my claims to fame is that some buddies and I think we got Shawshank Redemption on the approved R-rate movie list, so stick it to the manism right here. But, something about my personality, if you don't know me well, I'm a classic 8 on the Enneagram. I'm a challenger. I don't like rules just for the sake of rules. I have this little punk rock rebellion thing going on in my blood. And so some of those rules I would just be like, what is this about? What are we talking about here? This is not really what life is all about. And, I was thinking about other kind of rules that we're experiencing right now. I know that we're listening to health officials as we're trying to go through this pandemic and get to the other side of it. But it's kind of been funny to me. There's some rules that are we just got to admit, it's kind of silly, right? Like, it's kind of silly that we can go to restaurants and we have to have our masks on as we walk through. But as soon as we sit down with the people we're sitting with, we can just take our masks off. It's almost like the virus just goes right over our heads. It can't get low enough for a booth or a table, right? Or maybe my favorite one is playing sports, especially football. High school football, these guys, they can beat each other up for the whole game and be breathing all over each other, sweat, spit all over the place. And they can do that, but as soon as the game's over, they can't shake hands with the opposing team because that's just too close of contact, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy. It's just sometimes you got to take a step back and think sometimes these rules are silly. And as we talk about rules this morning, I know there are people here in the room with us, joining us online, that when you think about Christianity, church, Jesus, any kind of religion, you think that it's all about following the rules. And so what we want to do, I want to take a look at this short passage in Matthew chapter 23 together. We looked at this last week. If you want to just get a good laugh, Matthew chapter 3 is Jesus in the New Testament being an incredible insult comic. He's just doing these sick burns to these religious leaders, Pharisees of the day. And this is what he says about these Pharisees, these religious leaders who thought their stuff didn't stink, that they were on top of the food chain spiritually. This is what he had to say about them in rules. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Jesus is saying here, rules can get in the way of people experiencing God's love. Rules that he's talking about the Pharisees do, they're a heavy burden on people. And sometimes they're such a burden that they never lift people up. They just push people down. And Jesus says, don't follow their example at all. And like I said, there's a lot of people today, maybe you yourself, that think that Christianity, Jesus following, Jesus being a Jesus follower, being a Christian, it's all about following all the rules. Like the TV show The Simpsons, which has been on since 1956 at this point, right? It's had 40 seasons. It's a great cultural barometer when you think about it. I mean, it really pegs our culture and our society in a really good way and how people think about things in our culture. And there's one episode from 1996 I read this quote from this last week. Couldn't find the clip, but Bart Simpson is asking Homer, his dad, hey Dad, what religion are we? And this is how he described what religion he was. This is Homer saying this to his son. The one with all the well-meaning rules that don't work out in real life? Christianity. That's the one, right? There's some uncomfortable chuckles in the room this morning because we know there's a lot of people that picture being a Christian, Christianity, as just trying to follow all the rules or at least making sure that other people are following the rules, even though they might seem to stumble. And what's the character on The Simpsons that's kind of the stand-in for the conservative Christian guy? Was it Ned Flanders, right? He answers his phone on Christmas and says, Christ is born, Flanders on your horn, or something like that. It's the weirdest thing. But some people picture Christianity as following all these rules, and it's all about that. No fun, no partying, no alcohol, no sex, no enjoyment of life, no fun at all. That's what some people, maybe yourself included, think that Christianity is about. And what I want to talk about this morning is that Jesus came and he brought and he ushered in this new way of doing life that I think it flipped the script on that narrative that following Jesus and being a Christian is all about following the rules. He does something way beyond that. And he invites you and I into something way beyond that. So we're going to take a look this morning at a passage in the Gospel of Luke, starting in chapter 14, verse 6. And the Gospel of Luke is an ancient biography of Jesus' life. You know, in the ancient world, when somebody was really important and people were talking about them after they died, they would write down these ancient biographies. And in the New Testament, this is kind of cool, maybe just to me because I'm a geek, but we get 4 of them. 4 different ancient biographies of Jesus' life, of eyewitnesses recording things that Jesus did and said. And the Gospel of Luke is one of them. And I want to take a look here in chapter 14. One Sabbath day, Jesus went to eat dinner in the home of a leader of the Pharisees, and the people were watching him closely. There was a man there whose arms and legs were swollen. Now, a couple things we need to explain here. He says this happened one Sabbath day. You know, in our culture today, in our society, you know, Sunday, a lot of Christians call Sunday their Sabbath. It's the day where many of us don't have to work. I have to work, but most of you guys don't have to work on Sundays. And we, watch football a lot of times. We chill out. We just do a lot of things around the house and just hang out and get ready for our week. And it's kind of got this like special aspect to it still today in our culture. But in the ancient world, the Sabbath was so much more than that. I mean, it was a sacred day and a sacred tradition of resting, going all the way back to the creation poem at the beginning of Genesis, where God rested on the 7th day. He worked for 6 days and rested. This is what ancient Jewish people thought about the Sabbath. It was sacred. It was holy. You weren't supposed to lift a finger on the Sabbath, just supposed to rest. And so on this Sabbath day, Jesus went to eat dinner at the home of a leader of the Pharisees. Now, a small little sidebar here that could be a whole sermon in itself. Jesus went to have dinner and ate dinner at this Pharisee's house. Now, the Pharisees were the bad guys, the ones that would ultimately put Jesus to death or want Jesus to be put to death. Jesus entered into their home, broke bread with them, sat at the table with them, even though they had an opposing worldview, and even though they were enemies of Jesus. Jesus still did that. That's a little sermon in itself, right, about the way we could follow Jesus. But back to the text here. He's in the home of a leader of the Pharisees, and people were watching him closely. And you see probably on the stoop of the home of this Pharisee's house, or right in front of the Pharisee's house, you see this guy who is lame, this guy that can't walk. We're told here that his arms and legs were swollen. This was someone who would be an outcast of their society, someone who couldn't worship in the temple because of their condition, their handicap. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't work. They were begging for the rest of their life. People looked down on them thinking that the sins of their father or their mother or their grandparents were the reason why he had this handicap. Here's somebody just sort of sitting there, and Jesus takes note, like he always does, of suffering. And he makes this a teachable moment and a miracle to boot. We see here in the next verse, this is what Jesus does. He asks the Pharisees a question. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the religious law, is it permitted in the law to heal people on the Sabbath day or not? You know, we might find this being like a silly question, like, Jesus, what are you getting at here? Of course you should do good on the Sabbath day. But you got to understand, in the ancient world, this was a really controversial question, because you weren't supposed to do any kind of work. You weren't supposed to barely lift a finger on the Sabbath. And in the Old Testament, where this law is taken from, there were 613 laws, not just the 10 commandments, 613 laws. And then the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the experts in the religious law, they actually added volumes and volumes of other interpretations of these laws, case studies in these laws, where they were called the Mishnah, where they were adding laws on top of laws to make sure you didn't break the law at all. For example, in the Mishnah, these laws on top of laws, you were allowed to spit on a rock on the Sabbath, but you weren't allowed to spit in dirt on the Sabbath. You know why? Because if you spit in dirt on the Sabbath, you made mud, and you weren't allowed to make anything. That's how ridiculous, how granular, and some of you guys, that's a slow burner of a joke, an example that you're getting it now. But it's ridiculous. It's how granular they got, because they wanted to make sure they didn't break the law at all. And so Jesus asked this question, is it permitted in the law to actually heal, to do some good, to show some mercy and compassion on the Sabbath or not? And we see here what happens next is that the Pharisees are kind of quiet. They don't say anything back to him because they're probably thinking about it, feeling a little ashamed. And then this happens. When they refused to answer, Jesus went ahead and touched the sick man and healed him and sent him away. Then he turned to them, the Pharisees, probably with that like Samuel L. Jackson side-eye look. He turned to them and said, which of you doesn't work on the Sabbath? I mean, if your son or your cow falls into a pit, don't you rush to get him out? Again, they could not answer at all. Jesus is pointing out their hypocrisy here, saying, hey, I mean, you guys, you would all do something if your son, your daughter, or even your livestock fell into a pit. You would lift them out. You would do something. But here you are, putting a heavy burden and making a barrier between God and people with this heavy-handed law keeping. What are you doing? You guys this is an example, an adventure, and missing the point is what Jesus is saying. Jesus calls them out. You know, it's funny, other passages where Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath, we're given this little tidbit that the Pharisees were so offended, they were so upset that Jesus did this, that they got together and they started to plot Jesus' murder. Yeah, that's right. On the Sabbath, you can plot someone's murder, but you can't heal somebody. That's how ridiculous this was. And this is how Jesus responds. This is how he caps off this moment here. It's found for us in the book of Mark, the same encounter. He says, he looked around at them angrily and was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. Jesus looked around at them, kind of shaking his head like, come on, man. And he was deeply saddened. I mean, this to me is the attitude, the heart of a parent, isn't it? If your son, your daughter does something that you're like, this is awful. You're angry because you know they're better than that, but you're deeply saddened because you know they're better than that. It doesn't have to be this way. And you don't want them to cause harm to anybody else. But this to me is just the heart of a father in his response. He's angry, but he also is deeply saddened. And so overall, I want us to understand this, that when Jesus was hit with this collision between following the rules to a T or doing good, this is how Jesus responded. Jesus put doing good ahead of following all the rules. Jesus put doing good ahead of following the rules. He wanted to show mercy and compassion, and he made a point to do that instead of following the law all the way to the letter. And it made him angry when people would use laws, use rules to build a barrier between God's love and them. Not only did this happen in Jesus' life, but fast forward about 30, 40 years into the New Testament, there's this guy named Paul who's a church planner, and he's a pastor and starting new churches in the ancient world where they didn't hear about Jesus. He's writing to a group of Jesus followers in the city of Galatia, and it's recorded for us in the book of Galatians in our New Testament. But there's a controversy going on in the city of Galatia that Paul needs to pastorally speak to. And here's the controversy. The Jesus movement began after Jesus' death and resurrection. It began and only Jewish people were becoming Christians, but God's love couldn't be contained to one ethnicity, and it was never supposed to be. So it spread out to people that weren't Jewish people. But this caused an issue because for Jewish people to become Jewish people, to be fully devoted God followers in the Old Testament, every man who was Jewish had to be circumcised. And yes, we're going there. I bet you weren't planning on talking about this Sunday morning. But they had to be circumcised. And not to get too granular, don't Google this in church. Google it over lunch, I guess. That's weird too. I guess Google it later if you don't know what that is. But let's just say this. It was a very intimate surgery for a man. And it was something that was extremely painful. And there were some Jewish Christians that were saying, hey, for you to become a Jesus follower, to be part of the family of God, I don't care if you're 13, 38, 47, we're going to have to do this thing. And they're saying you've got to be circumcised to be part of God's family. And Paul sees this, and man, he is upset about it. So this is one of the main reasons he writes this letter for us in the New Testament called Galatians. If you can't believe this is in the Bible, you got to check the Bible out. This is really there, right? This is how Paul puts it in Galatians chapter 5, verse 6. He says, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision or uncircumcision has any value. Those old markers of being in and out, if you were circumcised or not, they don't matter anymore because in Christ Jesus, he's doing a new thing. He says this, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. The only thing that counts is you trusting Jesus and what he did for you and as you walk your life, and that being expressed through your love for one another. This is the only thing that counts. And Paul, he actually gets angry. He goes off on these Jewish Christians who are telling people that they have to be circumcised before they can be part of God's family in Jesus. This is what he says just 6 verses later. And this is in the Bible, you guys. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. Can you believe this is in the Bible? This is Paul being very angry. I mean, I bet you didn't think this was in the Bible, and it'd be really weird if I found out later this was one of your life verses, so let's not make that happen at all. But this is Paul getting angry too. And you know why Jesus got angry when people were putting the heavy burden of rules and laws on people, and why Paul got angry in this example? Here's why, right here, we'll put this up. Jesus and Paul got mad when people used religious rules to block access to God. Oh man, this made their blood boil. when people would use rules to have it block people's access to God and his love. This was the antithesis of the movement of God in the New Testament and for us today, were for rules to stand in the way of full access to God. And it makes Jesus angry. It made Paul angry when we use religious rules to be a roadblock, to be a heavy burden for anybody to have access to God. But this gets complicated, and this is like the complicated part of the talk this morning, because we have to do some theology. And I know that might sound intimidating to you. It might sound like this is something for the experts, professional Christians, whatever the heck that means. But I want us to go on this journey together, because it's really important for us to understand where we are today in the story of God. That God has been moving throughout human history in different ways, but where we are today is a new day. It's a beautiful day. It's a freeing day. And it's the way that God is asking us to follow him today. But we need to understand where we are. You see, in the Old Testament, that big chunk of your Bible, it's, in other words, it's called the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the Old Testament. Another word for testament is the word covenant. Old covenant, Old Testament. It was God's deal, God's covenant, his agreement with the nation of Israel. That's what the Old Testament is, and the Old covenant is. It's God's commitment and his deal with the nation of Israel. And there's so much beauty in the Old Testament. It is God-breathed. It is scripture 100%, and it's powerful what we learn about God. But we need to understand that God's laws in the Old Testament, they're not on you and I today if we're followers of Jesus. You know, for example, the Old Testament was beautiful, and it was so progressive for its time. It's beautiful in lots of different ways, but one way is it was familial. It was like family language. You look at one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. We might think that sounds kind of petty of God to say, like, why would God need that? That sounds kind of insecure or whatever. But the reality is that that's the same kind of thing you would say to your kids about you being their father or your mother. You know, you shouldn't have any other father or mother above me. I want you to follow me. You're under my wing, under my protection, under my guidance. Don't put any other dad or mom above me, right? It's familial. It's understandable that way. It actually helps our health in a lot of ways. See, in the ancient world, the Jewish people, this is before modern science and the scientific revolution, so people didn't know how people actually got sick at all. And there are a lot of laws and rules in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, that help people not lead into a pandemic or a plague. For example, I got to read this one to you. This is Deuteronomy chapter 23. We'll categorize this under, I can't believe this stuff's in the Bible, but we have to read it in King James because it makes it interesting. Thou shalt have a place also without the camp, whither thou shalt go forth abroad. And thou shalt have a paddle upon thy weapon, and it shall be when thou wilt ease thyself abroad. This is about going to the restroom outside of the camp, if you haven't picked up that yet. Thou shalt dig therewith, and shalt turn back and cover that which cometh from thee. This is literally in the Bible, you guys. But this is actually really, really important for us to understand. You see, this is before modern sewage systems and before bathrooms and all this kind of stuff. So when people would go to the bathroom, they had to go outside of the camp, and then they had to cover it up under the ground so it wasn't open air to where there'd be disease and plague come from it. This is one of the main reasons the bubonic plague happened, is because people did not do this in large cities in ancient Europe. God was giving laws for people that could help them thrive and live, and the King James language makes it really, really interesting. Categorize this under weird life verses as well. But here's another example of the laws, you guys. The Old Testament law was beautiful because it gave dignity to people in war. No other place in ancient laws or rules or any kind of antiquity in writing was there ever dignity for when there would be a victor come in and win a war. It was all just pillage and do worse than that to the community. But in the Jewish law, the Old Testament, they were told if they won a war, they were supposed to marry the widows, bring them and fold them into their family, adopt their children, the orphans, into their family as well. They were commanded to do that. It was beautiful, beautiful stuff. So it was an amazing thing. The Old Testament, the old law in that way was a beautiful thing. But Jesus fulfilled the law, you guys. We don't live with those rules anymore. Here's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. He said this, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, destroy them, but I have come to fulfill them, to complete them. I am doing a new thing. So those random verses you pull out of Leviticus, they're not binding on your life anymore because I have fulfilled them. I am doing a new thing. And you guys should be so happy that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament law for us today, because now you can get a tattoo and it's lawful. You can eat shrimp. You can eat coconut shrimp. You can eat Bubba Gump shrimp, however you want to have shrimp, right? I mean, you can play football. You can watch football because you can touch a pig skin. And here's one that everybody should say amen to. You can eat bacon now because the law has been fulfilled. You can have bacon-wrapped shrimp. I mean, it's all possible now, right? The Old Testament laws were beautiful for a specific people and for a specific time, but Jesus has fulfilled them, you guys. The old covenant, it's not binding on you if you're a follower of Jesus. It's not binding on anybody anymore. And the author of Hebrews takes this a step farther, and you might think that this sounds like heresy, but it's actually a Bible verse. This is what the author of Hebrews says. When God speaks of a new covenant, it means he has made the first one, what has he made it? Obsolete. It is now out of date and will soon disappear. The author of Hebrews is saying all those laws in the Old Testament, I mean, we can learn from them and they're scripture, but they're not binding on your life because Jesus is doing a new thing. He's doing a new thing, giving a new covenant, a new deal with man. Have you guys heard of the golden rule? Remember the golden rule? Do unto others as you'd have them do to you, or treat others the way that you want to be treated. I mean, that's a really cool thing. But Jesus, in this new covenant, this new deal he's making, I'd say he ups the ante a little bit. And he calls this, Andy Stanley, a pastor that I love, he calls this the platinum rule of Jesus, right? This is the platinum rule of Jesus. This is the new law, the new covenant, the way that Jesus followers are supposed to interact with the world. This is what Jesus says. It's found in John chapter 13. So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. You see what happened there? This isn't the golden rule. This isn't you should love people the way that you want to be loved. No, he takes it the next step. He ups the ante. He says this, that you should love one another the way that Jesus has loved you. You should treat one another the way that Jesus has loved you. Oh man, come on. This is what's amazing about this, you guys. Listen to this. When you ran from God, when you wanted to have nothing to do with Jesus, what did Jesus do to you? How did he treat you? He still pursued you. He still loved you. When you saw the world in a different way than Jesus invites you to see the world, what did Jesus do? He came after you still. He loved you. He invited you in with a radical hospitality. Did Jesus, when you didn't want to have anything to do with him, or when you were walking in your own way, did he throw a bunch of rules at you or laws at you? Did he wag his cosmic finger at you? No, how did he treat you? How did he treat me? He wooed us with his kindness and his grace. I'm telling you, I've been a pastor now for 12 years, and I've never met somebody who has been shamed into falling in love with Jesus. Never met a soul. Somebody who's been shamed or condemned into falling in love with Jesus and following Jesus. So this is the new law. This is the new covenant that we're supposed to love others the way that Jesus has loved us. So here's a commanding and clarion call question for us, you guys. This is something that's been so powerful for me. And this is, for us, how we're supposed to walk in this world. Asking this question, what does love require of me? You know what's beautiful about this question? What I find so powerful about this question is that, you know, with laws and rules, you can weasel yourself around laws and rules, right? You can make caveats and you can be, well, in this case, you should do this. And you can have basically your own version of Mishnah, making different examples over lots of different laws so that you can do what you actually want to do. But you can't weasel yourself around this question. We know what love requires of us all the time. In your relationships, at your work, with your career, with your financial world, with the time that we all have. What does love require of me? This is the question of Jesus. Because my friends, if you're a Jesus follower, this is what you need to know, that you are not called to be a person of the law. You're not called to be a person of rules. You are called and invited to be a person of love, letting love drive and direct your steps. So what I want to do is I want to take 4 case study examples here for us to look at something that could be very law-driven in that old kind of way, rule-driven, and instead we're gonna work it out through this example of love driving us and loving people the way that Jesus loved us. So the first case study we want to do is financial generosity. Why do we give to charity? Why do we give to nonprofits? Why do we give to church? I think so often we're stuck in this old covenant way of thinking where it's like, well, I give because there's that verse that says that if I do give, then God's gonna bless me back with a bunch. It's like that quid pro quo Jesus. I do this, Jesus does this. I scratch God's back, he scratches mine. I mean, there's that kind of thinking. Some people give because they feel like they should. I ought to. And so they are motivated by guilt. They're motivated by shame. And they want to make sure that they're on the right side with God. And so God's not angry with them. But that's old covenant. That's rule thinking. There's some brain science over the last couple of years that says that when you give, and you give out of the goodness of your heart and out of the motivation to actually help somebody, the part of your brain that lights up is the pleasure center of your brain. The same part of your brain that lights up when you eat an incredible piece of cheesecake. It lights up when you give and you're happy to give. But when you are coerced to give, when you are shamed into giving, when you feel like you ought to give, oh man, what happens is your brain actually diminishes and your pleasure center of your brain diminishes. It's bad for you because you and I, we were created to be generous, not because we ought to, but because our Father, our Heavenly Father, our Jesus, he was generous to us and he was kind to us. So why do we give? Why should we give? Not because we ought to, not because we want something in return. We ought to give, or we should give, and we should want to give because Jesus gave to us. And because there are people that are in need, and we want to meet that need because that's what Jesus did. We give because there's people in need, and that's what Jesus did for us. The next example is this: going to church. Going to church. There's a lot of people in the same way that they get up and they go to church on Saturdays or Sundays because they feel like they ought to. They feel like if they get here, they get a special gold star in their heavenly book or something like that, where God's going to maybe bless them this week because they went to church. And maybe that's part of the reason why you get up and go to church. But I think that's just the old rules, law way of thinking about going to church. There's a recent study done this last month during the pandemic, looking at lots of different cross sections of culture and society and their mental health. And the only subset of people, the only cross-section of people where people said their mental health was actually as good or a little bit better than before COVID-19, you know who it was? It was people that actually got up and physically went to church on Sunday mornings. So there's just something about getting going and being in a community of people, even if it's spaced out, even if we're wearing masks, that it's just good for us. And no guilt to you if you are watching online this morning, but this is just what the science tells us. And so teaches me something, that we shouldn't go to church because we feel like we ought to, or we feel like we're going to get something out of it from God in this kind of weird deal. But we should go to church because it's in this place that we can experience God's truth and God's love and community of people, where maybe we can sing some lines from that song that Katie sang this morning, Goodness of God, or other people can sing it for us and we can hear it because we can't even believe it for ourselves, and it's good for us. Jesus, in another teaching in the New Testament, says that man wasn't made for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. Having that rest, having that time with God, it's good for you. So don't go to church because you feel guilty, and don't us dare ever wag our finger at somebody for not going to church to shame them, because that is not the way of Jesus. We go to church because it's good for us, and Jesus does something in us, and we're better because of us. Here's this next one. I'm going to get in trouble for this one. So grace umbrella, grace umbrella, grace umbrella, grace umbrella. Drinking alcohol. And a couple caveats here. What I'm about to talk about is for people that are over the age of 21, people that do not have problems with addiction. And what I'm about to talk about might not apply to everybody, even in that group of people. But I grew up in a religious circle where drinking alcohol was really looked at being basically next to murder, right? I mean, it was like really, really a bad sin. And I think that sometimes we put this heavy burden on people that has no basis in Old, New Testament, or in the way of Jesus at all. There is nothing scripturally that will tell us that it is a sin to have a drink of alcohol. or 2 drinks of alcohol or something like that. Actually, there's lots of passages in the New Testament and Old Testament where it's a gift from God for us to enjoy responsibly. But it's all about honor, you guys. It's all about honoring ourselves and honoring people, other people. When you overdo it, when you drink too much, you dishonor yourself because you're in a place to where your senses are lightened to where you might do something that's going to hurt you or hurt somebody else and dishonor them as well. It's about that intention about what could happen underneath more than it is about the substance that you're putting in your body. So don't ever try to pull a verse out of context and shame somebody saying, oh, they had a beer, so you know the kind of group that they're hanging out with. Oh, they had a drink, and you know this, you know that. No. It's about honoring other people. It's about loving people the way that Jesus loved us, to be under control, to grace them with our presence, and to love them. So don't ever be guilted for having a drink if you're of age and you don't struggle with addiction, and don't ever guilt anybody else. That's old covenant, old rule way of thinking. It's not the way of Jesus. Okay? I could do a whole sermon on that. We'll do that another time after you guys kick me out. Here's the next one right here. Cuss words. And I could do a whole one on this one too. A lot of times we think that curse words, swearing, which I know none of you guys have ever heard or said any of the words, right? Not at all, right? I know. But here's the reality. There is no verse in the Old or New Testament where there is like a laundry list of the bad words you're not supposed to say. Like, that'd be a really interesting verse, right? If they were all right there in a verse, I bet it'd be quoted often. But there's no list of the bad words at all. But what Paul gets at in the New Testament when he talks about our language is about honoring each other and loving each other, and it's about the intention of our words. I think there is nothing more sinful and dehumanizing and broken and outside of the way of Jesus than actually looking at somebody and demeaning them, telling them that you're an idiot, you're stupid, you're worthless, you're a loser. I believe that the heart of God is grieved so much more hearing those words than maybe a list of 4-letter words that you can't say on TV. And the intention behind our words matters so much because they either honor or they dishonor this person made in the image of God who Jesus died for. So, honor others with your words, not because there's a list of bad words you're not supposed to say or a list of words you're supposed to say. Honor people with your language because the person across the table from you is made in the image of God, and Jesus loves them in the same way he loves you. Don't do it because there's some kind of Bible verse, or don't do it because you feel guilted into it, but do it to honor people, to show love to people. You guys, don't forget this. We'll put this up on the screen one more time. That Jesus put doing good ahead of following the rules. Jesus put doing good in front of following the rules to a T. And it made Jesus angry when people used religious rules to put a barrier between God's love and them. Let's not be a group of people who are called the rule keepers. The keepers of the law, the keepers of the rule. Let's remember that we are called to be people of God's love, following that platinum rule and letting the question, what does love require of me, guide our footsteps.